Good day. As is traditional with this channel, I'm going to start my discussion today with a brief overview of the situation on the battlefronts. Now, the first thing I want to say is that yesterday saw more attempts by Ukraine to launch artillery and missile strikes on various Russian-controlled positions behind the front line. There was a missile attack on the town of Melitopol, which is one of the places along the land corridor from the Donbass to Crimea, which has sometimes been spoken about as the objective of the Ukrainian offensive, which some people say the Ukrainians are planning to launch from Zaporozhye to break through to the Sea of Azov. Now, there's been totally discrepant accounts about what this missile strike, which was carried out with HIMARS missiles, by the way, actually achieved. Both sides acknowledged that some of the missiles, the Russians acknowledged most of the missiles got through. It seems that Melitopol has not got the elaborate air defenses that other places now have, which is perhaps not entirely unsurprising. I suspect those air defenses will be built up, will be strengthened over the next couple of days. But anyway, in the meantime, most people accept that the air defenses were unable to shoot down most of the HIMARS missiles that were launched against Melitopol, and that the HIMARS missiles that got through destroyed a resort complex. Now, there's totally different accounts as to what the effect of that is. The Ukrainians claim that this was a resort complex converted into a military barracks by the Russians. They say up to 200 soldiers, Russian soldiers, were killed and injured over the course of this attack. The Russians say that it was a purely civilian facility and that about 2 people have been killed and 10 injured. Now, I have no way of knowing who exactly is telling the truth from these reports, but I do find it astonishing that people in the British media simply accept and reproduce the Ukrainian version of events as fact. I mean, maybe it is. Maybe this was a military base. Maybe this was a place where, as one British newspaper, I think it was The Guardian, claimed it was Wagner, the Wagner Group has its bases, its operatives in this area. Maybe that is correct. I've seen no corroboration for those Ukrainian claims, and for what it is worth, I think the Russian account of what happened is more likely the correct one. I say that because I follow very closely Russian reports as well as Ukrainian ones, and some of these Russian reports are extremely critical of the Russian authorities, and I can't help but think that if a large number of people, Russian soldiers, had indeed been killed in a missile strike in Melitopol, I would have probably seen some corroboration of that fact from Russian reports. I just mention this because sometimes I do find Western reporting of the war very strange. By way of a further example, I saw a report in The Guardian by, I think, Peter Beaumont, who claimed that the Ukrainians are now on the east bank of the Dnieper River, presumably in Kherson region, though he doesn't make that completely clear. I saw that his colleague, Simon Tisdall, also talks about Ukrainian advances in Kherson region, presumably east of the Dnieper River. I haven't seen a single report that confirms a Ukrainian landing east of the Dnieper River in any Ukrainian or Russian source. I followed a link that Simon Tisdall has provided. It referred to witness testimony from people in a town on the East Bank called Alexei, who spoke about the fact that they could hear machine gun fire, which isn't unsurprising given the fact that this is a town literally on the bank of the river itself, and obviously there's lots of cross-border shelling going on from each side of the Dnieper River towards the other. But no sense did this person, it seems to me, corroborate any account of a Ukrainian landing east of Kherson, east of the Dnieper River in Kherson region. So I have to say again, I find it very strange that British journalists, people who are presumably trained in reporting, report battles, offensives, advances, sometimes on the basis of just what the Ukrainians say. On other occasions, it seems to me, invented almost out of the whole cloth, largely based on witness testimony, which, when read carefully, doesn't seem to confirm these accounts of these Ukrainian advances, at least in Kherson region specifically. Anyway, I mentioned that. So there was a Ukrainian strike on Melitopol. Perhaps more importantly, and doing significantly more damage, Ukraine was also heavily shelling Donetsk city, and it's been doing so to a great extent over the last few days. Now, Ukrainian shelling of Donetsk city, as opposed to Ukrainian missile strikes on Melitopol, or indeed Russian strikes on various infrastructure, civilian infrastructure across Ukraine, get almost no attention in the Western media. And the shelling of Donetsk has been particularly bad over the last couple of days. I saw one report which said that 10 people had been killed over the course of a 24-hour period in Donetsk city, 10 people who were clearly civilians. Well, you would not know that the shelling is taking place if you took your news from the Western media, even though the weight of witness testimony from Donetsk city makes the fact of this shelling irrefutable. And then the Russians have also confirmed more Ukrainian missile strikes, HIMARS missile strikes, in the battlefield areas of northern Lugansk, northern Donetsk, and Kharkiv region, where the Ukrainians, at the conclusion of their Kharkiv offensive, were trying to break through into Lugansk region, but where more recent reports suggest that they've been pushed back and are on the defensive again. So that's what the Ukrainians have been trying to do. They've been trying to launch missile strikes. The missile strike on Melitopol has once again, it must be said, reignited talk about this Ukrainian offensive towards the Sea of Azov. That may come, it may not. I have no idea. I would have thought the chances of it are reducing, given the pressure on Ukraine, on the Ukrainian military, in various other places along the front lines. But obviously, I'm not in a position to say with confidence one way or the other. There is, however, again, now increasingly appearing in the British media, at least, articles which are starting to run against the orthodoxy, the official narrative that things are going well for Ukraine, that Ukraine is winning. And yesterday, the Daily Telegraph had a rather interesting article, which is about General Surovikin, of all people. And it's by James Kilner, and it reads, Putin's new General Armageddon. By the way, apparently, this is a mistranslation of Surovikin's nickname. Doesn't mean that he's General. Apparently, he's not General Armageddon. He's General. Apparently his nickname isn't that, and it isn't meant to mean that. I'm not quite sure what it does mean, but it's a Western name apparently given to him. It's not a Russian one. But anyway, going back to the article, Putin's new General Armageddon injects discipline and stabilizes Russian army. And the article then goes on to say, I'm not going to read the whole article, it's behind the paywall, but he goes on to say Sergei Surovikin is a dangerous adversary for the Ukrainians as he plots to freeze the nation into submission. Whether that is really Surovikin's intention, I'm not going to get into at the moment. But then the article goes on to say the Russian military commander, known as General Armageddon, has stabilized Russia's front lines in Ukraine since taking over in October and injected discipline into the Kremlin's army. Analysts say that General Sergei Surovikin's organizational abilities and ruthlessness make him a dangerous adversary for the Ukrainian army. And then there's the usual story about how the Russians were supposedly in full-scale retreat until Surovikin took charge, and how Surovikin then persuaded Putin to order the retreat from the withdrawal from Kherson region. And a Western analyst, Ms. Masikot, says that during that operation, I saw a few predictions that the withdrawal across the Dnieper would end in a Russian forces bloodbath. It did not. And the fact that Surovikin was able to carry out this retreat in good order is mentioned. And then the article says that since pulling back, Russian soldiers have dug a network of trenches that exploit the natural Dnieper River defenses and will be difficult for Ukrainian forces to breach. And the article then goes on to say, Russian forces now pound Kherson city daily with artillery shells and fire hundreds of missiles and drones at civilian infrastructure targets across Ukraine. And then there's an awful lot about how the Kremlin is supposedly trying to break civilian morale across Ukraine. By the way, I've seen no evidence that this is the case. This is an inference from the attacks on the Ukrainian energy system. I'm going to come to that in a moment. But then the article goes on to say that it is this ruthlessness. I don't know why we harp on Surovikin's ruthlessness all the time, but anyway, the article does. It is this ruthlessness and attention to detail that makes Surovikin a tough opponent. And I have to say that this article in the Daily Telegraph is accompanied by an opinion piece which acknowledges that by appointing Surovikin, Putin has again gradually wrested the initiative back from Ukraine. It talks at length about the scale of the Russian buildup. It says that even inferior Russian weapons in vast numbers will outmatch the allegedly or superior Western weapons that Ukraine is equipped with. And I'm not going to dwell on the, to my mind, obvious falsity of that claim. I've discussed it in many previous videos. But anyway, never mind. But then the article actually makes an interesting point, which is that the assumption that Putin is irrational, that he's interfering with the conduct of operations, that he makes irrational commands of his generals, is contradicted by the Kherson withdrawal. And the article makes an interesting comparison between the German leader during the Second World War, who insisted against all military logic, supposedly, about holding out in Stalingrad, and the fact that in contrast, Putin accepted the advice of his military leaders and withdrew the troops from Kherson. And that means that the forces that were withdrawn in good order from Kherson have been redeployed to fight again, and that leads on to the really big battle that is taking place, which is the one in Bakhmut. Now, I'm not going to dwell more on these articles in the Western media. I just find them interesting. I just want to make 2 points about them. Firstly, the persistent tendency in reporting the war based purely on Ukrainian reports. And I've always said this is a dangerous thing to do. It disregards the extent to which each side in a war is inevitably going to spin things to make them look better for themselves. And if you simply accept that one side is telling the truth, then what you're going to do inevitably, and what much of the Western media, especially the British media, has done, is you're simply going to become a vehicle for that one side's propaganda. And the second point is that despite this bias to report things from a Ukrainian point of view, you're now starting to see increasing numbers of articles which throw doubt upon Ukraine's long-term prospects. And we've had this article in the Daily Telegraph about General Surovikin's abilities and about his success in injecting supposedly discipline and stabilizing the front lines, and the fact that he was able to carry out an orderly withdrawal from Kherson region and redeploy his troops successfully to carry on the battle in Bakhmut. I would say that the last is wrong. I see no evidence that the soldiers, the troops who are carrying out the offensive, the Russian offensive in Bakhmut, are the same troops who were withdrawn from Kherson city. It seems to me, on the contrary, that most of the Russian troops who are involved in the battles in Bakhmut are Russian troops deployed, other types of troops, motorized infantry and that sort of thing, deployed to Bakhmut directly from Russia. But anyway, to press on, that does bring me to the topic of Bakhmut. And there's been a certain amount of news, quite a lot of news, trickling through about what is going on there. We've been getting reports now that the Russian soldiers, well, it's a Ukrainian report, Russian soldiers have supposedly infiltrated deep into the residential areas, and that some kind of street fighting is now apparently taking place right across Bakhmut city. It's a report I cannot confirm, but it does seem that the Russians have been making more advances, certainly in the industrial suburbs of Bakhmut, as they seem to be work towards tightening the ring that they have already, also it seems to me, to a certain degree, established around the city and its defenders. I would say that over the course of the last week, the previous week, the Ukrainians, for their part, seem to have carried out another of their regular counterattacks, this time directed at Russian positions in a place called Opytnoye. Now, there are also, it seems, various places, various villages in eastern Ukraine called Opytnoye, but this clearly is the Opytnoye close to Bakhmut, and it seems that the Ukrainians were trying to retake this place to break the momentum of the Russian offensive in Bakhmut, and perhaps to try and reopen secure lines of communication with the troops who are defending Bakhmut. Well, it seems that this attack has been repulsed, that it's failed, even though some fighting around Opytnoye is still apparently taking place, and elsewhere the Russians around Bakhmut continue to be on the attack. Now, I would make the point that, of course, last week, as I've discussed in previous programs, last week was the week when the Ukrainians were able to send some British journalists into Bakhmut, along touring the battle lines, speaking to carefully prepared Ukrainian soldiers who discussed the state of the battle. By the way, I make no criticism of the Ukrainians for preparing their soldiers before they spoke to journalists. It's a basic precaution. All armies in war do that if they have any sense about what they're doing. But anyway, I do wonder whether this tour of the British journalists to Bakhmut, whether that might have been intended to some extent to coincide with this Ukrainian counterattack. There have been many Ukrainian counterattacks in and around Bakhmut, but this seems to have been a particularly strong one. Perhaps the Ukrainians were hoping that the journalists would come, would see evidence of Ukrainian progress, of Ukrainian success, and would be able to report it back to their readers in Britain. Well, if so, it hasn't turned out like that. On the contrary, as I've said, the counterattack seems to have been repulsed. The Ukrainians appear to have suffered losses, and the reports suggest that the situation in and around Bakhmut continues to deteriorate. Now, I just wanted to say one more thing about that Daily Telegraph article, which made the comparison between Stalingrad and Kherson region, about the fact that Putin did not fall into the error that a certain German leader did, which was to insist that troops hold out in undefendable positions, allowing themselves to get surrounded and destroyed, but on the contrary, withdrew them on professional military advice. Now, the point this article failed to make is that keeping troops in undefendable positions, allowing them perhaps to be encircled and destroyed, but certainly to experience losses in very heavy numbers, is something that Ukraine has done regularly over the course of this war. It happened in Mariupol, it happened to a great extent in Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, and of course it's happening again in Bakhmut. And perhaps Bakhmut is the worst case of all, because though it's very difficult to get a sense of total casualties, it does seem that Ukrainian casualties in Bakhmut have been the highest of this war so far. So I just make that point because, again, the subject of Stalingrad and about sensible, rational retreats, withdrawals in order to conserve forces has been floated. And it seems to me that if you really want to compare any battle with Stalingrad, it clearly isn't Kherson, it was Bakhmut. Anyway, the other thing, of course, that has been happening in the war is that the Russians have been continuing their missile and drone strikes. Now, for a couple of weeks, we stopped seeing Uranium-2 drone strikes, but they resumed with a vengeance a few days ago. Major target was the energy system in and around Odessa. That has been apparently completely disabled, and Odessa is now without electricity and apparently without water. And there's been protests rather, from some of the people in Odessa at the harsh experiences that they've been having. So this has been we've seen the Uranium-2 drone strikes resume, and even as I'm making this program, I'm getting reports of more Russian missile strikes across Ukraine, but they're very, very sketchy. Basically, they're air raid warnings. I'm not sure exactly what is going on, and that will be a topic that I'm going to discuss in my next video if a big strike of that nature is indeed happening. But anyway, that's where we are on the battlefields. Ukrainian attempts to hurt the Russians with HIMARS strikes and artillery strikes on Donetsk. But the reality is, despite chatter, continued chatter about a Ukrainian offensive in Zaporozhye, that the major battle that's going on remains the one in Bakhmut, and Ukraine, from every source now, every source that's been reporting on the progress of that battle, appears to confirm that Ukraine is losing and that it is suffering extremely heavy losses whilst it is doing so. Anyway, that's the situation, as far as I can see, on the battlefields today. An awful lot is going on in the meantime around the world. Now, in my previous program, I discussed Angela Merkel's interview with BITCHUTE and Putin's response to it. And I should say that echoes of this interview have ricocheted around the world. I've seen discussions of it in all kinds of places. The Serbian president, Vučić, who's now facing a crisis in Kosovo, I'm going to come to that in a moment, he's also talking about this interview. He's, by the way, criticizing the Russians for having the wool pulled over their eyes by Merkel and by the Europeans and the West. And there's been commentaries about it in China, in India, apparently. I haven't seen the Indian ones. In all sorts of places. I don't know whether people in the West fully understand the damage that this particular interview has done, the revelation that the Western powers, throughout the entire period of the Minsk process, were acting, at least some of them, in bad faith, even if Merkel herself was changing her position basically as the situation on the ground or in the diplomacy was changing. But certainly this has been a very damaging affair. It's resulted, by the way, in some speculations, including speculations made to me privately in private emails I received from members of the community, the Duran community. Some have suggested that what Merkel was doing was making implicit criticism of US and British policy. Supposedly that it was the British and the Americans who provoked the war, and that this is essentially what she's giving away. Others have said that a bitter and angry Merkel has basically thrown the entire West under the bus by making these admissions. I'm not going to go anywhere close to that far. I think, as I said, what Merkel is doing is trying to repair her reputation in Germany, where the mood at the moment, at least officially, is a very belligerent one, and where there's a great deal of criticism of her supposed policy of appeasement towards Russia. But whatever, the fact is that her interview has done very considerable damage indeed. And that might explain, by the way, why this interview and her admissions has been almost entirely ignored in the British and American, especially the British media. The only article I've seen that alludes to some of the comments that Merkel has been making has been in the Financial Times, where The burden of the article is about Germany's reassessment of Merkel, the fact that her reputation is being damaged, not the fact that she is admitting that the West effectively sabotaged or colluded in the sabotage of the Minsk agreement. But anyway, that's interesting to see, but internationally, outside the West, this interview has done very considerable damage. And there are some people in the West who seem to be determined to compound this damage. There's been yet another article by my old friend Simon Tisdall in The Guardian, who once more sets his face against any negotiation. He makes it very clear that he regards Olaf Scholz's rather desperate attempts to try to argue against a new Cold War as naive. And again, Simon Tisdall seems to talk about the need to have President Putin of Russia overthrown in order to secure peace. And the article actually was quite an extraordinary article, once more, speaks about Putin himself showing no interest in talking. Well, that is not the case. It's Ukraine which is currently refusing to talk, or has been refusing to talk, except with all kinds of elaborate and conditions. Putin has repeatedly said that he's prepared to sit down and talk, though how sincere he is now, I have no idea. But anyway, just saying this. But anyway, Putin, going back to Tisdall's article, Putin himself shows no interest in talking. That, in a nutshell, is the immediate insurmountable problem, obstructing all schemes and dreams of a benign post-war settlement. While Putin remains in power, peddling fantasies of a revived Russian global empire. I've seen no comment of Putin's, by the way, which speaks of him peddling fantasies of a revived Russian global empire. I have no idea what this is all about. And anyway, going on and squatting on Ukraine's sovereign land, the way ahead is blocked. Putin's fall is a prerequisite for lasting peace. That's how the article ends. Those words, Putin's fall is a prerequisite for lasting peace. No explanation, again, about how that is to be achieved, except presumably by continuing to escalate the war, by trying to engineer some kind of regime change in Moscow, perhaps by more drastic means. It's, if I have to say it frankly, a bankrupt way of thinking, one which it seems to me dooms us to perpetual war. And of course, it's based on that extraordinary assumption that if Putin were to fall or die or whatever, that any Russian leader who succeeded him would be more accommodating than Putin himself has been. Anyway, that perhaps tells us how blocked the whole situation remains. How, as I said, the fact that when Merkel tells us that there was no real goodwill at any point from the West in the Minsk process, we see that remains the case to this day. No negotiations whilst Putin remains in power, for all intents and purposes, at the moment means no negotiations at all. And what is then the end game? How do we get out of this war? Well, people like Tisdall, who are not just Tisdall, people like the various leaders who have led us into this conflict. Boris Johnson, by the way, has written a piece urging that all kinds of more elaborate and powerful weapons need to be supplied to Ukraine. Those kind of leaders, they appear to have no interest in finding any route towards peace at all. And the revelation of their bad faith, which Merkel has perhaps accidentally given us, shows how difficult the route back is going to be. Anyway, it's not just in Ukraine that things are happening in the world. We now have a very, very difficult crisis blowing up in Kosovo. This is this breakaway province of Serbia, which the Western powers have recognized as an independent state. Note, by the way, the contradiction. The West won't recognize breakaway regions of Ukraine, like the two Donbass republics, as independent or having a right to unite with Russia, but they insist that breakaway regions of Serbia, Kosovo in this case, have a right to break away from Serbia. I've explored that contradiction in many previous programs. I'm not going to dwell on this now. But there seems to be a major drive now to try to impose the authority of the Kosovo authorities on the remaining Serbian population in Kosovo. And note again the contradiction when there is action taken by the Russians in some places, which is seen as discriminatory or threatening to the independent identities of particular nationalities or ethnicities, be it Chechens or Crimean Tatars or Ukrainians. Well, that is, of course, something that has to be strongly condemned. But when the Kosovo authorities take action to establish their authority over the Serbs in Kosovo, well, that is something that needs to be supported. I don't want to draw exact analogies. It may be that there are differences, but again, it would be useful sometimes if people who support the one, what the Kosovo authorities are doing in Kosovo against the Serbs there, and oppose the other, what the Russians have done in the Caucasus, in Crimea, and in other places, if people who want to take those positions would explain a little bit more clearly what they see as the differences. Because I have to say, I find it difficult to follow the logic sometimes. But anyway, all of this is precipitating a crisis. The Serbian government is now talking about sending troops into Kosovo. The European Union and, of course, NATO are, to put it mildly, reacting in a very hostile way indeed to that prospect. I can't help but think, and I'm sure a lot of people will think, that this is all partly a response to the crisis in Ukraine. Maybe some people in the Kosovo capital, Pristina, maybe some of their friends in Washington and London are seeing Russia's distraction, its focus on Ukraine, as an opportunity to resolve the problem of Kosovo, this problem that has existed for many years now, to resolve it once and for all on Western terms by imposing, in effect, a defeat on Serbia. All I will say is that any such victory over Serbia in this part of the world is likely to be ephemeral and will be reversed the moment it appears that Western power in the Balkans is weakening. I speak that as somebody who comes from that part of the world, who is familiar with the world of the Balkans, and who knows that the attempts to impose these sort of solutions never bring lasting peace. All they do is prepare and set the scene for the next war. Anyway, we shall see. I can't predict how this situation is going to turn out. I don't know how strong the position of the Serbian government is. I don't know how far Serbia is prepared to go. I don't know how far the authorities in the Kosovo capital of Pristina are prepared to go. I don't know how solid support for them in the West is. And of course, I don't know how Russia is going to respond. But here again, we see another crisis blowing up in the Balkans, and a crisis which will have and has the potential to have long-term and very severe consequences. Looking further, the big news, and perhaps the most important news of all, has been Xi Jinping's triumphant visit to Saudi Arabia. I say triumphant because he's gone there, carried out a massive list of agreements with the Saudis. He's met leaders of other Arab states. He's forged a strong economic relationship with the Saudis. And as Alex Christoforou and I have discussed in a program devoted to this topic of Xi Jinping's visit to Saudi Arabia, it's difficult to see this in any other way than as a case of what has historically been a key Western ally, Saudi Arabia, realigning with the other side, with the Eurasian powers. And by the way, the Saudis and the Chinese issued a joint statement at the end of this meeting, talking about the partnership that the two countries have forged with each other, talking about their similarities on policies. And I noticed that this joint statement contains a provision about Ukraine, comment about Ukraine, and it talks as follows. This is specifically about Ukraine. On the situation in Ukraine, the two sides stressed the differences should be resolved peacefully and every possible effort should be made to avoid escalation so as to contribute to the restoration of security and stability and minimize negative spillovers of the crisis. Now, that is an identity of views between the Chinese and the Saudis. It's a statement with which the Russians will be happy. It makes no criticisms of the Russians at all. It talks about resolving the situation peacefully and with every possible effort being made to avoid escalation. Now contrast that with the position of so many Western leaders and commentators. I've just mentioned Simon Tisdall, who talks about carrying on, refusing to negotiate until Putin is removed from power. Well, Simon Tisdall is, of course, a journalist, but I don't think anybody who's followed this conflict closely has any doubt that removing Putin from power remains the stated desire, perhaps the intention of Western policy. And of course, right at the outset of this crisis, President Biden himself, in a speech in Warsaw, also spoke about the necessity to remove President Putin from power. So you can see the difference. Chinese and the Saudis in full accord over Ukraine, agreeing that there should be no escalation, that the situation should be kept under control. The West, some people in the West, eager for escalation. Boris Johnson talking about sending even more advanced weapons to Ukraine. Simon Tisdall and others talking about the necessity of overthrowing President Putin and of the Russian government, and talking in lurid terms about an empire, a Russian attempt to establish a global empire, of which, let me reiterate again, nothing that President Putin has said gives any reason to think that that is indeed his intention or his plan. So, we are still in a kind of stalemate. I think apart from a few brave people in the West, there is now a gradual changing, shifting mood about the war. There's gradually an understanding that things are not actually going well for Ukraine at all. There's a gradual understanding that the fight in Bakhmut is in fact going badly wrong for Ukraine, that Ukraine is suffering very, very heavy casualties. There's been these strikes, drone strikes and missile strikes on the Ukrainian energy system. It's been suggested that its primary purpose is to knock out not so much the energy system itself as the railway system, which depends, Ukraine's railway system depends on electricity. It's basically a system of electric trains, trains that run on electric power, that is intended to impede the efficient operation of Ukraine's transport system. Well, that's a big topic. I'm going to probably come back to it later. But anyway, people can see that this program of attacking the energy system is continuing, and there doesn't seem to be very much that the West can do to stop it. And ideas of negotiations to try and find some kind of way out of this crisis get floated every so often in the West, as by Olaf Scholz, but we see the strength and, dare I say it, the determination bordering on fanaticism of those who oppose negotiations, a negotiated outcome to the war. Simon Tisdall even brought up the word appeasement in connection with Olaf Scholz's weak and very confused comments. Anyway, even though these hardliners who reject negotiations appear to have no rational endpoint, no real plan about how they're going to achieve peace. Instead, it is they who peddle, well, maybe not so much dangerous fantasies as dangerous, extremely dangerous objectives, such as the overthrow of President Putin's government. I can't help but think that even as we remain in crisis in the West, spreading more crises within Europe itself, with its latest attempt to stir up trouble in the Balkans, between Serbia and Kosovo, even as we plunge deeper into crisis, what we find instead is that the other side is going ahead, strengthening its positions, cutting its deals. We've had Xi Jinping in Saudi Arabia, a big event, one, by the way, which has received minimal coverage, again, here in Britain, which I find astonishing, given Saudi Arabia's importance. And, of course, that trend, I anticipate, is going to intensify next year, with China now clearly signalling its determination to reopen its economy and its society, to leave the lockdown process behind it, something which is also, I have no doubt at all, going to have a major impact on the economic shape of the future as the Chinese economy moves up multiple gears, even as we see growing problems and this extraordinary stalemate in the West. So there we go. We have no plan, no idea of what to do. We talk about overthrowing Putin. We talk about sending more support to Ukraine, even though it's increasingly difficult to see what support we can give to Ukraine, which is going to achieve outcomes, any of the impossible and far-fetched outcomes which we have up to now set ourselves. And in the meantime, the situation in Europe is getting bleaker, it's getting darker, and we see how war, already entrenched in Ukraine with disastrous consequences there, is now being spread to the Balkans. Well, on these bleak notes, I'm now going to end this program. More from me soon. No doubt tomorrow I'll be talking about these air raid warnings, which we've been hearing about today, and we'll see whether in fact they have translated into actual missile strikes, and we'll also no doubt be learning more about whether or not about the progress of events in Bakhmut. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.